as well make a start. So this week what we want to do is reflect on some of the social theorists related to America. So in this lecture we're going to look at Alexis de Tocqueville, and then next on Friday we're going to look at W.E.B. Du Bois, and we're going to look at basically how there is an intersection between race and identity and nationhood, and seeing how basically the social conditions impact that. But today we're going to obviously look at Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, really to appreciate his work, American Democracy, our focus will be on that major work, American Democracy. We're not going to look at the old regime and the revolution, his other works. We're going to focus on democracy in America. Now, to really appreciate that work and that contribution, we need to kind of ask four broad questions. The first question that we should ask is obviously, who is Alexis de Tocqueville? The second one is, why did he actually go to America? The third, and perhaps an important question, is what did he see? What did he observe? What did he make note of? And we've got to be aware that he went to America in 1831. So America today in 2024 is obviously radically different to 1831. But what he saw, what he observed about the social reality of America, the political structures, he makes a lot of significant contributions regarding the American kind of system and condition. And then the last question really is about the impact and the legacy of de Tocqueville's work. So in its broadest sense, that's what we're going to try to do in this lecture. So the first thing that we want to reflect on, as kind of we always seem to do, when we're looking at the social theorist, it's kind of important to first understand the context. So what was happening when he came about in the 19th century? So de Tocqueville was born in 1805. What was the social reality during that time period in the early 19th century? Well, we know, and we discussed last time, that the French Revolution had failed, and in the vacuum of that failure there was immense terror. There was persecution, there was the reign of terror, and the social and political fabric that held French society together was collapsing. So there was immense problems. Now, this impacted de Tocqueville and his family directly. He was from the aristocracy. He was from a very established family within the aristocracy that could, draw their generations, 9 generations back to the kind of 1066 Hastings. But what's really important is during the reign of terror, after the French Revolution, de Tocqueville's family is targeted. So his great-grandfather was guillotined. His parents, his mother and father, were imprisoned and were due to be executed, but thankfully they were saved. This had a deep and profound impact, not just on his family, but on himself. The fact that his family, who were obviously from the aristocracy, had been victimized after the French Revolution, really damaged their psyche. There was significant trauma from this event. And this event will play a role in some of de Tocqueville's criticisms of democracy. Now, the other aspect, obviously, is after this kind of destabilization, disorganization, post-French Revolution, we have the establishment of a stabilizing factor. The rise of Napoleon, who establishes a popularist dictatorship at a real key time where there was a need for stability and order. So that's then established during de Tocqueville's time. And also the last significant point is the Industrial Revolution has been going for more than 100 years. And now what we see is social ills start to emerge from the Industrial Revolution. So what are some of those social ills? Any idea what some of those are? So we've had mass migration from the rural to the urban. We've had industrialization. These now large cities are producing all these factories, and there's a huge workforce in the cities. But what we see then is a increase or a real big gap emerge between rich and poor, and there is a lot of poverty on the streets. There are slums, there's poverty, there's a lot of people suffering from the socio-economic condition. So all of this uncertainty is going on, but there is optimism. From all of this, there is the view that actually democracy as a political structure, as a system, will be the future for Western society. It will provide the stabilizing force that we need to regulate society, to regulate the political system. So if this was the future for de Tocqueville, he wanted to know about this system. He wanted to study it. He wanted to understand it. And so he really wanted to engage in understanding the function of democracy. How does it work? Why do you think he particularly chose America? So he goes to America after the American Revolution. So the American Revolution's taken place, and he wants to understand how a republican democracy can be built after revolution, because the French have just had a revolution and they've had chaos in their society. They haven't stabilized. While the Americans went through a revolution, obviously a revolution for independence, but then they established a system of governance that seemed to work, that stabilized the society. So what made it work? What were the key elements to this democracy? So the first thing, obviously, we need to consider, and it's a significant question, why consider de Tocqueville a sociologist? Now, we kind of answered this when we looked at Rousseau, when we applied the same question. It's again somewhat the same answer. Auguste Comte coined the term sociology in 1850, well before de Tocqueville, well after de Tocqueville. So naturally, de Tocqueville is very much considered a historian, a political theorist, not a sociologist, because the term obviously was not coined, which means the discipline was not established. There's no methods of studying society set up yet. So that's an obvious. Now, what's really interesting about de Tocqueville is how he views democracy. He doesn't necessarily see democracy as a political system, as a political ideology, as a political phenomenon. Rather, he sees it through somewhat of a social lens. So how is that? How can democracy, which, if you think about it, demos, kratos, people rule, it's, voting, it's elections, it's political structures, right? It's your relationship with the state and how you elect representatives to legislate on your behalf. Surely that's political. Where is the social in that? What does he mean that it's actually more social than perhaps political? So if we think about it, if you look at any type of government, any government structure, government structures have a primary function, right? Which is to maintain public policy over society, which means regulate society. It tells us how we should live. It helps us live. It protects us, yeah? So in some ways, the state has to provide things like public services, yeah? Things like health service. It has to make sure that the society is healthy. The state has to basically maintain order. We had, obviously, back in Britain a couple of months back, riots. Why did the government, take such strong action against those people that were rioting? Because you need to feel safe in society. And one of the functions of government is to protect the citizens of the state, to make sure that there is law and order established. If that breaks down, all the relationships, all the trust falls apart. You can have a collapse of society. So the government has to maintain order. It has to socialize the young. It has to obviously do a lot of other things like collecting taxes, protect the borders. But what we see from this is that democracy then is not just one dimension, basically us voting. There's a whole social aspect to regulating life's affairs. How we live, how we act, how we behave, what is right and wrong. These are all dictated by democracy. So democracy is about the who. So there is this who aspect of democracy. So you've got the who, which is obviously you have the voters and you could say the candidates or the parties. That's the who aspect. The what aspect of democracy is the function of government, that it basically regulates the affairs, regulates the social relationships and the economic relationships within society, protects them, safeguards them, and makes sure that basically law is applied. The most important thing is the how. What do we think we mean by the how aspect of democracy? This is how the individuals participate within the system. Now for de Tocqueville, this is a key aspect, because he's not just referring to the singular of us voting and general elections which happen every 4 years, and that's pretty much the tip of the iceberg for our engagement in democracy. He's talking about basically participating at all levels of society, and the most important engagement occurs at the local level, where you have these kind of civic associations, which we will talk about, and that's really participation and engagement at a communal and societal level. So democracy is much more than what just happens at the top of the pyramid of the political system. It trickles down. There's a whole kind of impact for democracy. Okay, so the other aspects now, point 2, 3, and 4, relate to America as a case study. So he felt America was a good case study to study the functionality of democracy. The first thing about the US is that it is a society marked by equality of social conditions. Any idea what we mean by that? So in France at the time, and across Europe, what you had was that, in essence, political participation and political power was concentrated to a very small segment of society, the elite, the aristocracy. They had voting power, they could change and make law. But what happens in America is the widening of the social conditions, equality. So basically, the vote is extended and basically it becomes inclusive. So irrespective of race or gender, you have an equal share in voting power. So in essence, what happens in America is the social conditions are widened and we have greater equality, which then makes democracy much more accessible and, more importantly, inclusive, which makes then America, again, another great case study. The other aspect which makes America interesting for de Tocqueville is that the US has an absence of a privileged aristocracy by birth. What is he trying to say here? So if you look at America had, especially at the time when de Tocqueville is examining it, it had no remnants of a feudal structure. Okay, so why is that really important? If we think about it, take countries like, say a country like India or Pakistan, all right? India or Pakistan, these are supposedly democracies. Pakistan is a democracy. You have your general elections, you get people voted in. But large parts of Pakistan, especially the rural, is largely feudal, which means you have a large amount of land owned by a few people, the landlords. And they employ or have basically indentured workers, who are essentially the serfs, who live on the land. Now the problem is, a lot of these landlords have political connections and also run for political office. And they make it incumbent upon the worker, who's dependent, his whole survival is dependent to live on that land. They make them vote according to whatever their preference is. So in essence, what this suggests is democracy is incompatible with feudal structures. It doesn't work. You can't have democracy in a feudal system. So in essence, what he interested Tocqueville about America is that you don't have remnants of that. Why? Because in contrast to Europe, remember, evolved from feudalism to capitalism, which meant the feudal structures were there. They can't just completely disappear. You have an aristocracy, you have an established elite. They're there under capitalism. But for America, America didn't evolve to capitalism. It was born with capitalism. So that means the feudal structure, the aristocracy, doesn't have that same impact. Therefore, this is why de Tocqueville viewed the US as a commercial society, meaning it was market orientated. It was about commodity exchange. If you work hard, you can get ahead materialistically. So it kind of created a level playing field for everyone in America. Hence, the slogan, the American dream, that if you come, you can work hard and you can really elevate your social position economically. Okay, so before we go into some of the core points, it's worth reflecting on this statement by de Tocqueville, who says basically, I passionately love liberty, legality, respect for the law, but not democracy. That is the deepest of my feelings. I have an intellectual taste for democratic institutions, but I am an aristocrat by instinct. That is, I fear and scorn the mob. How do we interpret this? What is de Tocqueville saying here? So the last bit is somewhat obvious from what we talked about. He is born into the aristocracy. He faced the scorn of the mob during the Reign of Terror. So inevitably he has some degree of reservations when it comes to this aspect of the mob, or what he will refer to as the tyranny of the majority, when it comes to democracy. He also says that he has an intellectual taste for democratic institutions. This is what we're going to look at later, which is civic associations and the engagement that happens at the grassroots levels in a properly functioning democracy. Now, the first part is de Tocqueville admired the American system. In particular, he admired the checks and balances inbuilt within the American political and legal system. So, for example, you have the president who has executive power, you have Congress who has legislative power, and then you have the judges who are functioning as the Supreme Courts. Now, all of these have a separation of power. So what makes the American system somewhat protected is that there is accountability built into the system, which he liked. There were checks and balances. There was separation of powers. There wasn't one body exerting itself over the entire system. Each held each other to account. So this is what he admired. But now, what also he's talking about is when we have, like we said, the social conditions become to be expanded, or basically you have equality. The problem with sometimes equality is that it can create what he reviewed as an atomized society. Any idea what we mean by an atomized society? So somewhat what happens to society is that society can break down into smaller parts. So like an atom separates into smaller parts, it can be broken down into smaller parts. Society can break down in that way. And what happens is you have society, you have like the national level, but then also you have like the local and the individual. And the individual, importantly, becomes more and more disconnected from the state and society. This is what can be quite problematic in a democracy, because then you'll have a lack of engagement. Okay, let's go to the main kind of points. So if we're looking at democracy in America, I think obviously before we understand that, de Tocqueville gains a grant to travel to America to actually study the US penal system. So he goes there, spends 10 months in 1831, going across America, studying the penal system, which afterwards he produces a book related to. Several years later then, he publishes, based on all his experiences, his knowledge, his encounters, his interviews, 2 volumes, Democracy in America, Volume 1 and 2. both have slightly different kind of perspectives. So the first part is examining the danger of the tyranny of the majority. So what do we mean here? If you think about it theoretically, democracy is meant to be in opposition to tyranny. Democracy stands in opposition to tyranny. But what de Tocqueville is saying is that basically democracy creates a special type of tyranny that is the majority. The majority can become the tyrant, right? So a lot of his discussion relates to this. So how can that happen? How does a majority become a tyranny? So the first point is this lack of direct involvement. In representative forms of democracy, what you have in representative forms of democracy is you have a hierarchical political structure, which means the people basically vote for a few people, and they basically are elected into office, and they have the power to make decisions. They have all power to make all decisions related to our life, right? So basically, right and wrong is dictated by this small group of people who have been elected into office. So if tomorrow they want to do a generic ban on smoking, they can do it, which impacts, obviously, individual liberties. So in essence, this is a representative form of democracy, right? So every 4 years, we elect a group of people to basically regulate our affairs. So we are disconnected from how our affairs are regulated. Basically, we're told what we can do and what we can't do. So in essence, this creates a lack of direct involvement with how society is regulated, how society functions. Also, what this does is it creates a concentration of power. This small group of people that we elect have full and absolute power. Now the problem is, we also have a capitalist society where what you have is 95% or 90% of the wealth is held by just 10% of the people at the top. So basically, this small group of 10% or 5% hold the majority of wealth. Now, that wealth creates special interests that they have. Importantly, this group, if you want to call them the elite, also own or can control the market, and they often control the media. So in essence, they dictate a lot of the issues. Added to that, to become elected in modern democracies, you need funding, especially in the American system, to run your campaign. So these big elite are the main funders to a lot of these campaigns. So as a result, they often are able to kind of yield influence over those that are meant to be making decisions for the people. So are they acting in behalf of the people or for this special kind of rich elite? So this again creates the third thing, which is an imbalance of power then. So now, well, also another way of looking at this imbalance of power is, if we look at the whole idea of representative democracy, the majority are the one who rule, right? So what that means is, theoretically, as long as you get 51% of the vote, that's the majority, and the other 49%, even though it's nearly half your population, have to be subdued to the majority. That doesn't really even happen in most democracies. Like we said, I think it was the last general election, we said Labour got about 35% of the overall population vote, right? That means 75%, the vast majority of the people in Britain, did not vote for the people that are making decisions on our behalf. So again, this creates an imbalance of power. There's a concentration of power. So what he's suggesting here, de Tocqueville, is that this can be extremely dangerous. The reason being is, what happens is, if you have a majority the minority groups or people can be marginalized. So, for example, think of immigrants, think of, I don't know, the poor, think of even like ethnic groups or Muslims, for example. Yeah, just a popular example. The majority, which tends to be much more homogeneous, meaning they're a lot more the same, not reflecting of this difference, can wield their power against the minorities. All right? So often what happens is, why is it that certain people are demonized when it comes election time? So, for example, immigrants. Immigrants become a big issue that, oh, look, they're coming in, they're basically making the whole health service collapse because there's so many of them coming in, which directs people's attention away from what actually are the root causes of a lot of problems. The fact that the current government doesn't fund enough of the health service, and directs anger towards this minority group which has a lack of representation anyway. So what we see is, this is a major kind of danger that can emerge in a democracy that de Tocqueville talks about. Now, the other aspect of the book we will go into in a couple of slides down. So the question then is how to safeguard from the majority. How do we safeguard and maintain a kind of a safer system? So one aspect we talk about, we talked about the kind of equality of conditions, where obviously by expanding that can safeguard things, but there is also other aspects. So for de Tocqueville, he never accepted or agreed with regular elections. He said elections should not occur on a cycle, fixed cycle, like 4 years, 5 years. Why is that? Why shouldn't we have a fixed cycle in a representative form of democracy? Why is it problematic? What could be the dangers of that? Any ideas why? So for him, he says that basically the agenda can be hijacked by the majority, like the examples we said. Now, another aspect of this issue related to safeguarding from the majority, we are going to talk about it a little bit more, but civic associations. Any idea what we mean by civic associations? So in 1831, when de Tocqueville toured America, studying America, one of the things that fascinated him were these civic associations, which are basically voluntary groups. And you had an array of different voluntary groups. You could have a voluntary group about anything, from cleaning up the park to anti-tobacco kind of associations, or anti-alcohol, to women's associations, various different associations, right? So associations form at the local level. Now, why do they form? The local community identify a problem. So that could just be, like I said, too much litter in the streets in a park. And instead of petitioning government, the state, to do something, the locals organize themselves and work to solve the problem without the need of the state. So this is actually engaging in civic society. It's trying to solve problems, but not being reliant on or dependent upon the state. So you have all these different local associations, you have different civic associations that work to solve local problems that the local people best understand, not waiting for government, not waiting for the apparatus and the bureaucracy to kick in, but actively solving problems. So a lot of local associations that he witnessed were things like, working to establish a church, or build a hospital, or build a school. These things he saw in America, and he saw how, at the local level, American society was actualized or engaged. They were engaging in civic affairs. Now, this is kind of understandable to some degree, because America, if you look at the landscape, especially in 1831, America was just really a collection, a lot of small towns. Small town America, a lot of small towns. Yes, you had big cities, but often the vast majority of America was all these small towns, which had a communal kind of spirit and association. So in essence, that helped. Also, these associations, civic associations, aren't necessarily restricted to the local. So often, some associations like the Anti-Alcohol Association became so popular that it became national. It went across state boundaries, and other associations connected it till it became a national association, right? Okay, so what we need to also reflect on is some of the other issues related to democracy that de Tocqueville is critical of. One of those is that democracy breeds materialism. Now, why might that be a problem? That democracy perhaps breeds materialism. Is that a bad thing? From de Tocqueville's perspective, as a Frenchman, when he reflected on French society, making money in French society, especially at the time, was not a priority. Now, why was making money not a priority? Well, half the reason for that is because we had a very established social structure. So we had the aristocracy. So you had things like status was well established in French society. There was an aristocracy, there was hierarchy, right? So if you look at the aristocracy at the top, they didn't need to make more money. They had land, wealth, they didn't need to go out, make money, accumulate a lot more. So they had wealth. And the problem was that the vast majority of people were poor. And they were generationally poor, meaning your parents, their children were born into a fixed socio-economic condition, and the structures maintained this order, right? So it was very difficult to gain social mobility in France society. So as a result, people weren't necessarily driven by materialism, the need to accumulate wealth, right? So happiness was judged by a different system. So happiness, life, existence often was influenced by religion that predetermined wealth. So religion dictated that, if you're going to be poor, you're poor, it's God's will, and maybe in the afterlife you'll have heaven and you'll be wealthy. So this kind of made people to some degree content with their material position. However, this is not the case in America. America, as de Tocqueville suggested, was a commercial society. So in America, basically, there was the kind of materialistic value. So people were kind of driven by the ideal that, look, if I come to this new land, if I work hard, and working hard is not a bad thing, and I'll basically make money, and then I can buy myself a big house, have a nice car, and have a nice phone. And in essence, material happiness was the criteria. So basically, you're successful if you have all those things. You're unsuccessful if you don't have those things. So in essence, America had a tendency to view things according to this material kind of worldview, which is problematic. If you take an example, let's say you have a book, a fantastic book, a book that is really good, a brilliant book, but it doesn't sell. In America, they judge goodness on sales. So even though it's a good book, it'll be deemed bad because it did not sell. The market dictates goodness of a thing. So if a lot of people buy it and read it, then that book is good because it makes a lot of money. So there is a material value to American society that was slightly different that de Tocqueville noticed. The other thing was this idea that democracy breeds envy and shame. Any idea what he's talking about here? And in particular, he asks a question. He says, why the Americans are often so restless in the midst of their prosperity. He couldn't understand why there was this constant drive for material success. So what often happens in American society is that basically you have an inverse relationship. You have an inverse relationship between basically high expectation, and dissatisfaction. So if your criteria for happiness is material possessions, big house, big car, whatever, then that is what you want. You want those things. These are the things you want, Now, some people can get those things. However, there isn't always an open playing field to attain those things. So, for example, a lot of African Americans who, as we're going to find out on Friday, the social conditions are not the same. They've had hundreds of years of slavery. You had then segregation. They were kind of pushed into these ghettos where there was a lack of investment, a lack of resources, lack of funding in the institutions, there's high unemployment. So they aren't able, they're not given the same kind of opportunity to attain material success. So naturally, if the goal of society is to basically have all these material things, when you don't have them, that will create a sense of dissatisfaction, which can be a drive. So this creates a gap in need fulfillment. Another aspect when it comes to these 2 points is often when we talk about the equality of conditions. Now, yes, the vote was made inclusive, which is a good thing. However, American society, as it evolved, did become, obviously, a class society. All right? So you have, let's say for argument's sake, 2 classes. You have the middle class and the working class. Now, often what happens is that the politics of these 2 classes are not the same. So some have described working class politics or issues as being driven by bread and butter politics. So what does that mean? That the working class are driven by bread and butter politics, while the middle class are not. Their politics is higher value politics. So obviously, the working class who have less materialistically are working for the basics. They're working to keep, food on the table, keep the electricity going. They're just surviving day to day. So their politics is driven by that need, by that economic need, which is to survive. So they want to make sure that there is housing policies. They want to see that there's benefits and social security is maintained, because that is directly linked to their interest. But the middle class, who have a better standard of living, who aren't struggling to survive each day, well, their politics is not going to be dictated by bread and butter. Their politics is dictated by higher value issues, because now, if you've secured your basic needs and instincts, then what is your politics? Your politics is going to be a lot more different and be focused on maybe, I care about the environment, I'm going to really work on that. Someone who is struggling to survive, to pay rent, to basically put food on the table for the children, they can't really care about the environment. They need to care about their basic needs first. So it's okay for the middle class to basically have those other higher values, but this shows that the social economic reality dictates politics according to specific groups. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so moving on to another point that de Tocqueville makes, which is the idea, what he observed is this idea of the democratic mentality. So he observed amongst the American people that democracy was much more than just a political term or a political system. It was a way of thinking. Now, what does that mean, that democracy is a way of thinking? Think of it from this perspective, and he was in particularly focusing on the mentality, the mind, right? The human mind is susceptible to differences, contradictions, and biases. So what do we mean by that? That the human mind is susceptible to differences, contradictions, and biases. Well, we all, from our life experience, have different experiences, encounters. So my upbringing is radically different to some of your upbringing, and so forth. So that gives us a sense of difference that we will have. Now, the problem is, let's say, for example, in a kind of representative democracy, you have three types of people, right? You've got this person who's, let's just say, an elite, a male elite, very wealthy, from the rich, all right? This person could be from the middle class, a single mother, middle class. And this person here is, let's say, African American and working class, right? Now, if this person is elected into political office, his experiences, encounters, how he views the world is going to be shaped by his social reality. He cannot understand the needs of these two people because he's never experienced it. He's never experienced poverty. He's never experienced maybe racism. He's never experienced maybe being a single mother or whatever. So now if this person is elected to office, he's going to be shaped by his own mental perspective, yeah, which he will shape on reality. So he might say, look, we need to have budget cuts, right? So we need to cut unemployment benefit. We need to cut child benefit, which is going to impact directly these two people, their lives. But he doesn't really, he's never seen poverty, he's never experienced difficulty like that. Yet he's going to regulate the affairs of these people. So this is why democracy also can be quite problematic, and also why democracy should be also seen through the social lens, right? The other 2 points that are mentioned here is what de Tocqueville talks about when he says, often we are driven by radical doubt and the critique of tradition and authority. So what he suggests here is that basically from the Enlightenment, we had this kind of need to constantly doubt everything. That's kind of the post-Enlightenment thinking. And so what that means is we constantly doubt the state. If we constantly doubt the state, then that can create a fracture, that can create a disconnect between the individual and the state. The other side of that coin is then a sense of weakness and insignificance. So let's just say we doubt the state. We think it could be corrupt. So like when in 2003 the government said to us, Tony Blair said to us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Most of us probably knew that that's a lie and fabricated. They did it. We had doubt in that. It creates a gap between us and the government. But then the other side of the coin is we have a sense of insignificance as well. The state is so big and powerful and huge. What can we do? Which can also weaken our connection to the state. Okay, another point that he makes, which is about individualism, which is more from kind of volume 2. He asserts that basically, if you look at the individual can be impotent in society. The reason for that is because the state can be too big and overbearing. So the government grows in size and it becomes big. And what happens is the individual citizen becomes dependent on the state. So it's dependent on the state for social security. It's dependent on the state for all these different things, right? Which makes us more and more reliant on the state, which in essence we give up our own self-reliance. So in essence these impersonal forces dictate over us and we lose a sense of individual kind of self-capability. I know we're running out of time, so if we look at these quite quickly. So public virtue is seen as futile. Now this is connected to the idea that society is the thing that often creates virtue. It is the state that influences our thinking. The state influences our set of moralities and values that we create, which in essence can influence then our behavior, right? So this can be kind of problematic. And in particular, what he's saying in the last point is that there's no interest taken in the next person. Generally speaking, we are very driven by our own kind of individual sphere and self-interest. So my family, my friends maybe, and that's it. I'm not that directly interested in the other. So what can happen in this type of society, we lose our communal connection and we become more individualistic, focused on our own material self. Okay, so this then leads us to the next point, which is self-interest. In some ways, self-interest can be a bad thing because it breaks us from society. But actually, there is the idea what Tocqueville observed, which is something called collective and shared interest. So this is where, let's say, in my local area, I live in Bangor, the community basically, we all started to see there was a lot of litter around and it was attracting rats and these things. So some of the neighbours created a committee, association, and they basically said, look, let's start cleaning it up. Every other day or so, a group of people would go. And this started to kind of clean the area, and essentially the rats went down. So if you look at it, we were all individually affected as a community by this problem of rats coming in and that. So by collectively, so it was part of, I felt that as a problem, the neighbour felt it as a problem, but how we went about dealing with it was collectively through a shared committee by organising ourselves. We tried to maybe petition local council to send someone, do something, but they weren't responding. So this is one of the safeguards of democracy that de Tocqueville talks about. The civic association, the voluntary association, is the way you truly engage in democracy. Democracy is a grassroots system. It shouldn't be basically dictated from the top. It's about the local community solving problems collectively through direct action. Direct action is the key to engaging civic responsibility in society. So in many ways, for what de Tocqueville was talking about, yes, you can have dangers, the tyranny of the majority. You can become more individualistic and you can basically lose connection to the state. However, the way to harness and counter that is civic associations, civic groups. These are voluntary groups that work to keep society together. I don't know if we've got time. The last little bit is on religion. Another key observation that de Tocqueville observed is the connection between religion and politics. Now, in 1831, at the time, you had things like the Second Great Awakening. Any idea what that is? So the Second Great Awakening is a religious revival that radically shaped Christianity in America. So before the Second Awakening, Christianity was quite homogenous in America. After the Second Awakening, what happened is you had the formation of many different denominations and religious groups. So it fractured Christianity. The good thing that came out of that is religion became quite pluralistic and more accepting of difference. So there's different denominations, different ways of looking at the kind of Christianity and association with it. Now, how that impacts with state, well, religion in some ways provides a counterbalance to extreme individualism. How does it do that? So religion functions as a good civic kind of entity. It creates a sense of community, it creates a sense of connection, which then brings you it is somewhat kind of democratic in some ways because it's dealing with society at the local level and issues. So it plays an important function in building civic responsibility, and it kind of helps counter, again, the issue of freedom. There's a lot more to it, but maybe at some other point we'll catch up on this, but we'll leave